Okay, today my guest is Professor Peter Williamson. I'll keep my introduction short to maximize our time with him. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Peter as a person, Professor Williamson as a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally as a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I'll skip many of his accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Professor Williamson is an AIB fellow and a fellow and director of studies at Cambridge. Peter's research and teaching interests have focused on the impact of globalization of knowledge on multinational enterprise, the nature and implications of the rise of emerging market multinationals, strategies and competitive advantages of Chinese companies, cross-border M&A, and business ecosystem innovation. Peter received the Sloan PricewaterhouseCoopers Award to honor his contributions to enhancement of management practice. Much of his work is derived from deep engagement with companies and has been referenced in The Economist, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. Peter has served over 20 years as a non-executive director or chairman of companies in renewable energy, textiles, hedge funds, whisky, and software in Europe, USA, and China. Thank you, Peter, for joining us.
Thank you. Delighted to be with you, Ilgas.
Peter, what did you want to become when you were a child?
Well, actually, I wanted to become a farmer. I think it's because I enjoyed the sights and sounds and smells of nature and the space. So I guess that proves you can be an international business scholar, even if that's not what you want to be when you're a child.
Where did you grow up?
Well, a mixture of places, so partly in London, partly in Hong Kong, and partly in Australia. So we moved around a bit.
Interesting. And how did you choose academia?
Well, I didn't go straight into academia. After my first degree in economics, I went into banking, and I was interested in the economics part of banking, so I ended up joining the economics department, and then I worked for Merrill Lynch on strategy. But I had a professor from America in my last year of my undergraduate, and he said, "Why don't you apply for a PhD?" And I applied for a PhD in various places, and I got into some schools, but I wasn't really ready to go. And so the next year I only applied to better schools. And to my surprise, I got into the business economics program PhD at Harvard, and I decided I'd better go. And interestingly, after doing that, which was a joint program between the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences Economics Department and the Business School at Harvard, I decided to join Boston Consulting Group, and my professors were horrified. I'd already written some articles out of my thesis, and in fact, I went on to write a book on financial markets with Professor Hendrik Houtacker, who I'd been his teaching assistant. But I really felt I wanted to get some more real-world experience, and to be perfectly frank with you, I thought I needed to earn some money after years of studying my PhD. So I only came back to academia after 5 years in consulting. So it was a bit of a zigzag path to get there. And I'm not sure I always wanted to go into academia, but I really enjoyed the freedom and stimulation that comes with being an academic.
Something that is not on your CV that people might find interesting.
Well, when I was at primary school, one day a week, we had a kind of pop-up bank where pupils could deposit their savings, and they recorded them in a passbook and a ledger. And I was about 10, and a friend and we ran that bank. So I must have always been interested in commercial things. So that's what's not on my CV. I started out as a banker at 10.
That's actually quite funny. If you stopped, actually, I want to ask you, if you didn't become a professor, if you didn't become a researcher, and would you continue with the banking? Would you continue with the finance sector?
No, I don't think so. I think if I hadn't become a professor, I probably would have tried to become a barrister, probably working on international law. And, I think there's some similarities because, to be a good teacher as a professor, you need to want to sell your ideas to people. And in fact, to be a good writer, you need to want to sell your ideas to people. So I think that's quite close to being a barrister. But I'm sure I would have made a terrible barrister because I like the big picture and I don't have a lot of attention to detail and patience for detail. And I think to be a good lawyer, you need to really like details. So being an international business professor and strategy professor, I probably could deal with the details a little bit more nonchalantly.
Sure. Regrets. What is one thing you wish you would have done or done differently?
Well, as I mentioned, I worked in various things in banking and consulting and academia. But I never worked for an international organization like the World Bank or the IMF. And I think working for such an institution would have given an interesting, different perspective on international business from perhaps the one I got working with companies. As you said, I've been a director of companies and worked a lot with companies, but I think working with an international organization would have given a different perspective, and I never did that for various reasons. So that's probably something I could have done.
But it would also be half the salary of a Boston Consulting Group.
Yes, well, that might have been one of the reasons.
What's your biggest failure and what did you learn from it?
That's a very good question. Well, early in my career, about 3 years after I'd gone back to academia at London Business School, the dean persuaded me to become associate dean for the MBA program with a brief to totally renew the curriculum. And, I approached this like a good strategy person and did a lot of analysis. And when I came to implement it, I found a huge amount of resistance and I thought it was a great plan, but it turned out I'd neglected to get buy-in from people. And I guess the lesson I learned from that is that if you want to make something happen, you have to get buy-in from people and you have to build consensus. And I think probably the same is true when you're selling your ideas. You have to engage with people and where they're coming from, not just think where you're coming from. So I think that's the important lesson I learned. As a young person, I was probably overly focused on the analytics and getting the answer and under focused on actually engaging with people and getting buy-in to make things happen.
Interesting. And this happened when you were in mid-career? Is this early on in your career?
Yes, fairly early on. So I think I'd only been in academia for 3 or 4 years. So it probably wasn't really a good time to take on this associate dean position because it took up a lot of my time and I think my publishing probably suffered. But it seemed like an opportunity and I thought MBA programs were getting a bit stale and the curricula needed to be revitalized and so on. But actually, I wasn't senior enough really to know how to be a good leader and manager in a business school.
What are you most passionate about?
I think I'm most passionate about influencing people. I think you know, a lot of work that academics do, we enjoy the intellectual side, we enjoy talking to other academics and so on. But I think that probably because of my background with one foot in business and one foot in academia in my career, I'm very passionate about influence. Sometimes people ask me, you know, what should be the goal of business schools? And I say influence, either influence through policy or influence through students who go on to become leaders in different businesses or so on. But I think I'm quite passionate about what we are doing actually having an impact on the world and influencing the real world.
So, Peter, how do you explain your research and the importance of your research to people who don't read academic outlets or who are not in academic mindset?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And I sometimes, well, fairly often, again, because I work outside academia as well as inside, I do have to do that. And I suppose what I tell people is I help companies work out how to expand overseas and be successful abroad, both by teaching executives and as a company director and a consultant. And I guess that goes back to this influence thing. I think multinationals can be a force for good in the world if they're properly run and they have the right objectives. And I think, you know, developing that and bringing new ideas and skills from around the world to different places is a positive thing. And so that's what I explain to people I try to do.
You said multinational corporations do good or can be perceived as doing good. About the recent emphasis or increased pursuit in nationalism, increased tendencies for isolationist policies, populism, what is the next 5 to 10 years of the field going to be looking at these type of ideologies gaining power?
I must say I really worry about these trends because, again, I believe that interaction between people around the world is a positive thing and can have positive outcomes. So, you know, this kind of retreat to protectionism and inward looking, I think is a bad thing. But I think in terms of what that means for the field, I think we have to look again at what globalization can look like, what globalization really means, and what will be the next phase of globalization as we move forward, and how it will be changed by this kind of pushback that has happened. So I think a lot of IB scholars, including myself, more or less assumed that globalization was good and everybody would understand that. Of course, we knew there were some losers from globalization, and part of government policy is to try to compensate those people who are losing or help them move into different activities. But I think because of that, we underestimated the impacts of globalization on the way people were feeling, what they were worried about, the uncertainties they faced. And therefore, I think the field needs to think about how do we make the next phase of globalization perhaps work better for a broader range of people? How do we think more about compensating or avoiding some of the negative impacts of globalization? And I think there are real questions about what will the next phase of globalization look like? I mean, the data show that if you look at globalization in terms of trade or even in foreign investment, the integration of the world is more or less stalled. But what hasn't stalled is the flow of information and knowledge around the world. That's even increasing, perhaps even exponentially. So I think globalization in the future is going to be about different things, and it's going to be about the effects of globalization of information and knowledge, and we need to think through what that means for the international business field.
In an interview with Eleanor Vesney, she was talking about how the information flows are different because the MNE was established, first of all, as a local entity, and then the assumption was that the local managers would gather and operate locally, but information flows will be more local, adaptive, etc. But the information flows actually work the other way around, and information was gathered for headquarters, and the entire reason of the foreign location was to gather information to the headquarters, and it is a different perspective. So, I mean, there's something to be said about the future of globalization. I mean, you're an expert in this area, but I'm really skeptical.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting, in another sense, which what you just said about your previous interview made me think about this. You know, globalization has created a sort of sameness and flow of information from headquarters around the world. But at the same time, I think globalization is making local differences even more important. And in fact, they're even more important for competitive advantage, because as everybody has the same global knowledge that's flowing around the world, actually the difference becomes in the knowledge that can't flow around the world, that is locally embedded. And therefore, maybe competitive advantage is going to be more about what you can do with that local knowledge and local differences than the global one. The global knowledge might just become a table stake. I think you see this in the digital industries. I've been doing some research on this recently as to why some digital industries become global and some digital industries, the global players fail. And, you know, a lot of these digital industries like ride hailing or food delivery, they require an enormous amount of integration with the local institutions and customers and suppliers. And that's a very local problem. And actually, the capabilities on the digital side, everyone has them. You know, the people in China have them just as well or better as the people in the US or, you know, Indonesia or wherever. So actually, competition is becoming in some of those industries more about how successful you are at managing local integration.
Thank you. Peter, do you write every day?
Sorry?
Do you write every day?
Do I write every day? No, I don't write every day. I've actually written 10 books in my career, and when it comes to books, I find if I don't work for a week at a time, I can't make any progress, because you sort of have to get into the story of the book. And you can't write all day, every day over that week. You can probably only do about half a day at a time. Then you need a rest and to think and so on. When it comes to articles, I can do them a bit more piecemeal, you know, a bit each day. But I still need blocks of time to work on them. I think this is one of the problems with modern life, is that, emails distract us, and text distract us a lot. And I think, to really write something important, you need to have time both to reflect and to really get into it when you're writing it.
I want to ask about creativity in writing, creativity in coming up with these great ideas, and even the topics for a book, because it's quite different than writing a paper. A paper is 30, 40 pages. A book is, I don't know how many hundred. And one idea, it is consistent throughout the book, which is quite difficult to do, actually, if you're trained in writing articles. So how does your mind think? And what does your mind think of when it's thinking in terms of state of idle curiosity?
Idle curiosity. I think idle curiosity is often I'm thinking about how does our idea of internationalization change? How is it changing? How are people thinking about the relationship between the international world in this era of globalization? How are people thinking and feeling about that? Is it making them nervous and uncertain that they're not anchored to anything, or that they feel that forces beyond their control are influencing? When it comes to creativity, I think mostly I have found creativity by reframing things, by asking a different question. Sometimes I've come up with that different question, by being out in the real world with companies and organizations and so on. But I think in some ways the questions are harder than the answers, and creativity is often about coming up with a new question. And certainly when I go to write a book, the books have arisen because I found a new question about something. My most recent book was with Arnaud Demer, was on business ecosystems and how do you lead a business ecosystem around your company. And I got into that because I kept coming up against the question in the corporate world, how do you deal with disruption and uncertainty? And what I noticed is that what companies needed was a broader range of capabilities that they didn't have inside their company, and an ability to discover how to create a new value proposition by working with other people, and that needed to be flexible. So when they started out, they probably had an idea in their mind where this new value is, but not actually how to achieve it. And only by working with other partners did they actually start to converge on the answer to that question. So I think questions are very, very important. I think we're trained to spend a lot of time and tools and techniques on answers, but I think actually you achieve more if you ask a new and different and relevant question.
About the progression in the field from where we were and where we're headed to, you've seen a lot of trends, a lot of shifts, and some sort of an evolution of the field. What can you say about the new way of doing IB research?
Yes, I think the culture of IB has changed over the years that I've known it. It's now sort of nearly 40 years, I suppose. So I think there's much more of a culture of rigor than there used to be. I think in the early days we were kind of describing things and coming to some conclusions not in a very rigorous way. And I think that has good sides. I think it's helped us better with logic and also the development of a solid base of knowledge that we can build on in the future. But I think the danger of that, what I see as the danger of that in the culture, is that it's caused people to move away from some of the messy real world problems because they're not really so easily subject to this more rigorous, systematic approach. And that means we end up kind of talking to ourselves. And there are some really important problems out there that are really messy. And I think, we need to try to tackle them. But because they don't fit, easily fit with a kind of the models we're using or a rigorous approach, sometimes we might shy away from them. And I think that's a pity.
I mean, you're talking about relevance of research, right? How relevant is our research to practitioners and all these companies that you're consulting with or talking to? Well, what's keeping them awake at night? And how relevant is our research?
Yes. Well, I'm afraid to say I don't believe it's relevant enough. What's keeping them awake at night? Well, a couple of things. The first thing is, what is the advantage of being an international or a multinational in this global knowledge world where information and knowledge is flowing around? So the theory of why it was good to be a multinational is largely based on the idea that multinationals could move certain things around that markets and other mechanisms were not very good at. And I think that's being challenged because the markets for all sorts of things have got a lot more efficient globally, and information and even knowledge is moving around much more. So a lot of companies are asking themselves, how can I get advantage out of being a multinational? And I've been thinking for a long time, and this was part of the argument in the Metanational book that I wrote with Yves Does and Joe Santos, is that we've neglected the potential advantage of being a multinational in terms of that you can learn from lots of different places. We focused a lot on the ability or the advantage of being multinational in being able to take what it learned at home and replicate it or move it around the world. But I don't think we've put enough emphasis on the fact that because multinationals are over the world in different environments, they've got amazing learning opportunities. And most of them, at least in my experience, use the learning fairly much locally, and they're not using it in a way that really takes advantage of their potential as a multinational. So that's one thing that I find companies worrying a lot about. Has the advantage of being a multinational, is it declining? Is it decaying? What does the advantage of being a multinational look like with the internet and this sort of globally connected world that we're in? Another big thing I think they're worried about is back to these messy problems. So, how do I become a sustainable company, a company that is able to deal with something like climate change and so forth? And I think their first reaction is, okay, let's set up a supply chain to become more sustainable. And I think they realize, actually, we don't know how to do this or even what it looks like. so we don't know who should be our suppliers and partners and whatnot. So, so we've got to think much more broadly about, how do I bring together an ecosystem of different capabilities and knowledge to help me work out, what a viable sustainability in my company really looks like, and that I probably or certainly can't do this by myself, because it depends on what other people are doing, not only what I'm doing. So that's the second area I think people are thinking a lot about at the moment.
About advice portion, about mentoring, who was the most influential person on your upbringing in academic sense? Who had the most influence on your intellectual development?
I think the late Professor Richard Caves and Michael Porter, I mean, both of them were my thesis advisors. And I think they had the biggest influence because they helped me see how I could apply my knowledge of the discipline of economics to business problems. And that had a big effect on me, I think. Obviously, some of the important IB scholars like John Dunning and so on had a big effect also on how you bring some of these things into the international business context. But I think a lot of IB relies on underlying disciplines of various types, whether that be sort of sociology or psychology or economics. And therefore, I think, the people that have influenced me have helped me see how I could apply different disciplines to the IB field. And of course, because I'm trained as an economist, I tend to apply economics to it. But other people have shown, how to apply sociology or psychology or different things like this or mathematics to the IB issues.
But currently, the training in IB scholarship is much focused in very specific research questions even. So the doctoral student knows his paper and he can know those 40 papers, 50 papers that he's citing, but really they are not really discipline trained. So I want to ask you about the common mistakes that you see across junior faculty and PhD students, things that they are doing that they shouldn't do. And things that in your opinion, should be good advice for them to follow. What would those be?
Yes. So the first thing I'd say is a failure to check the kind of results of their theory or empirical work with what I might call the real world common sense test. So, I think it, again, that comes back to this view that I have, is that it's a pity if we can't get influence from what our work is. And so to do that, you really need to say, well, I've done all this and I've got these results, but do they make sense when I think of them in sort of more common sense, real world terms? So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, I find a lot of, especially PhD students and young researchers, they work with data and they do certain empirical work with their data, things I wouldn't know how to do now. They're too sophisticated for me, since I learned econometrics and this kind of thing a long time ago. But they do all this, but they don't really know their data. They don't really understand and explore their data. So I think, really getting to understand and exploring your data sets and looking for patterns in it and things in it, not just putting it through a sausage machine and getting the results out. Because I think, if you really get to know your data from different angles, I think it might throw up some interesting patterns you didn't think about, and that might help you innovate in your research. And also it might help this sort of test of whether the theory or the estimation you're doing empirically with these data, whether actually it makes sense in common sense terms, so the reasonableness test. So I think there's a lot to be said, and I often find PhD students who've done all this work on their data, but actually when I ask them about the data, they don't really understand the data. They don't really understand what it looks like. They haven't played with it enough. So I think there are a couple of things that I think are important that young researchers should do. And I suppose the third thing is, not getting locked into tram tracks of a particular theory in interpreting the data or your results or what you're thinking about. And I think that comes back to also being willing to ask a different question or to reframe what you're looking at. And of course, that's difficult for young people starting out because you don't have the confidence and you think, you better stick to where the field is going and so on. But the reality is we often find the field goes down dead ends or runs out of road in particular sort of ways because we've done that. And to make progress, you need to reframe the problem and ask a different question. And so don't be frightened to do that, even as a young researcher, even though you might worry it makes it more difficult to get published than perhaps something that's an incremental change to a well-established kind of theory.
That's right. Thank you. Peter, for the sake of time, what is a question that I should have asked you but haven't?
Well, I think it mainly follows on from what I said about the changing nature of globalization. So I think the question perhaps would have been good to ask is, how is the context of IB changing? Both the forces of continued globalization, integration, the forces of disruption, this question of whether globalization means that local differences are becoming less important or more important for competitive advantage and so forth. So I think the context in which we are doing IB is changing. One of the points that I often make to people, and I've mentioned in some of my own work, is that, when I started to work on emerging market multinationals, one of the things I realized is that these companies were internationalizing in a world which was already very global. That was very different from the organizations in the 20th century that were internationalizing in a world which was not global. So the context is totally changed. And that doesn't mean we have to throw away everything we learned about, the previous things, but it does mean that we need to ask the question, how is the context of IB changing and what are the implications of that for the questions we're asking, the results we've had in the past, the theories that we have.
Thank you so much for your time. This was very helpful. This was very informative. I'm sure the audience will agree with me. Thank you for your time, Peter.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for your questions. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to join you.
Thanks.